Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One particularly interesting and I think very insightful essay that Ursula K. Leguin writes near the end of her life, publishing in No Time to Spare, is called About Anger. And she begins in a kind of narrative or history when anger actually might have been much more useful for accomplishing certain things than it is in the present that we live in now. She's publishing this in 2017, and she tells us that in the consciousness-raising days of the second wave of feminism, we made a big deal out of anger, the anger of women. We praised it and cultivated it as a virtue. We learned to boast of being angry, to swagger our rage, to play the fury. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about the 1960s, 70s, going into the 1980s. And why was it so important to articulate and recover anger that was there? Because it had been suppressed for so long. Women had, been placed in circumstances where they were discouraged from, sometimes even punished for displaying the anger that they rightly had due to all sorts of various forms of discrimination and exploitation and even domination and abuse. Now, was that a mistake according to Leguin? Not exactly, but she talks about this as a time of feminism's childhood. If feminism was the baby at that time, she says it's now grown past that. She says we were right to do so. We were telling women who believed they should patiently, patience is traditionally conceived as an opposite to anger, right? Patiently endure insults, injuries, and abuse, that they had every reason to be angry. We're arousing people to feel and see injustice, the methodical mistreatment to which women were subjective, the almost universal disrespect of human rights of women, and to resent and refuse it for themselves. And she goes on and she's going to bring up another term that she'll use at multiple points here, indignation. Now, a lot of people mistake anger and indignation for being exactly the same thing. For Leguin, they're not. She says indignation forcibly expressed is an appropriate response to injustice. Indignation draws strength from outrage. Outrage draws strength from rage. There is a time for anger, and those early years, was such a time. Now, the wrong lessons sometimes get drawn about the usefulness of, say, an emotion or a certain strategy in one time, in one situation, and turning it into a universal. She talks about anger as being a weapon or as a tool. And she says that it's really only useful in combat and self-defense. Now, self-defense, legitimate, right? There could be problems in going too far with one's anger, as we'll look at in just a bit. Combat is a bit more of a neutral term. And this is where, she talks about the backlash against feminism. People to whom male dominance is important or essential fear women's resistance. Therefore, they fear women's anger because they know a weapon when they see one. And she says, listen, if women actually behaved like people on the right wing who are critics of feminism typically do behave, displaying the level of anger and even like outright rage that those people typically do, in fact, display and encourage, well, they would be targeted immediately. As a matter of fact, just the amount of anger that they do show gets them, like she says, those who see human rights as consisting of men's rights, labeled every woman who spoke up for justice as a man-hating, bra-burning, intolerant shrew. With much of the media supporting their view, they degraded the meaning of the words feminism and feminist, identifying them with intolerance. And that's the situation that we see today, where many people, as soon as they hear those words, they have all sorts of crazy ideas in their head about what they actually mean, which they've generally gotten from somewhere, right? They didn't just come up with it out of their own experiences or their own reflections. They're basically just parroting other people's talking points. And they identify women's anger when expressed as being intolerant, motivated by hatred, and then they behave hatefully towards them. And she says, the far right likes to see everything in terms of warfare, right? And she goes on and she says, okay, so we're in a different situation now. If we want to actually work for justice, for what she calls gender rights, then we're not going to get it through anger by itself. Mere anger now seldom proves a useful tool. And now notice, again, a distinction. Indignation is still the right response to indignity, to disrespect, but in the present moral climate, it seems to be most effective expressed through steady, resolute, morally committed behavior and action. So indignation could go that way, towards working for justice in a, let's say, more calm manner, or it could be channeled into anger and rage, which is not going to be as effective anymore. And so what is she talking about here? The political or public role. And she says, anger is helpful because it points to the denial of rights, but the exercise of rights can't live and thrive on anger. What can it actually live and thrive on? The dogged pursuit of justice, which doesn't need anger necessarily as a motivator or as a fuel. And she says, if things get worse, we may have to call upon anger as a weapon again. But we're not at that point yet, and I hope nothing we do now brings us closer to it. Now, this is several years ago, and perhaps, I think if Leguin were around today, she might say, well, now we actually do need it. But in 2017, when this is published, she is saying, not quite as effective. And why not? Well, there are some problems that come up with valuing anger for its own sake, which was, in her view, the right response back then when, second wave feminism as activism, as social transformation was in its infancy. Now, not really the right response. Why? Anger continued on past its usefulness becomes unjust and then dangerous. So instead of being a tool that automatically works for justice, to reduce danger to women or to whoever else, it ends up going too far and becoming injustice and becoming dangerous. She says, nursed for its own sake, valued as an end in itself, it loses its goal. Now, I think that, if we wanted to paraphrase this, what we have to say, by losing its goal, it loses its legitimate goal. Or rather, it winds up being steered into other goals, other ends, other purposes than what it was originally intended to do. She says it fuels not positive activism, but regression, obsession, vengeance, self-righteousness. And she says the racism, misogyny, and counter-rationality of the reactionary right in American politics is a frightening exhibition of the deliberate force of anger deliberate, destructive force of anger, deliberately nourished by hate, encouraged to rule thought, invited to control behavior. And she talks about an orgy of self-indulgent rage that is besetting our political fabric at the time that she's writing this. And I think she's quite right about that. Anger, when valued, when justified for its own sake, does go astray. It changes its goal, right? And so political anger, she says, all right, maybe not as useful now. But what about private anger? What about anger in our personal relationships, in our interactions, for example, while traveling or engaging in economic activity in the workplace, in buying and selling, and dealing with our neighbors? Maybe there's some good role for anger there. She says, I find the subject very troubling. Why? Because I want to see myself as a woman of strong feeling but peaceable instincts. I have to realize how often anger fuels my acts and thought, how very often I indulge in anger. So she's, coming clean about this in a way that I think is quite refreshing. And she says that, anger can be useful, but only in certain circumstances. So she talks about brief and open expression, an outburst of anger that can cleanse the soul and clear the air. She says a brief, open expression of anger. Now notice these two qualifiers. In the right moment, aimed at its true target, is effective, right? So anger at an abuser who is actually engaging in abuse could be quite helpful, could be needed in that situation. However, when anger lacks those qualifications, when it's not brief, when it's not open, when it's not at the right moment, when it's not aimed at the true target, then we run into all sorts of problems. And so she says, a weapon is appropriate to and justified only by a situation of danger, right? Anger nursed and nourished begins to act like anger suppressed. It begins to poison the air with vengefulness, spitefulness, distrust, breeding grudge and resentment, brooding endlessly over the causes of the grudge, the righteousness of the resentment. It takes on an energy, a pattern, a dynamic, an orientation of its own. What it is that we find negative in the emotion of anger, the danger, the injustice that can arise from it. And then she goes into a very interesting analysis of the sources of anger. She does note at the end that anger does tend to provoke more anger, right? Suppressing anger provokes anger. Expressing anger, may also produce anger. But she talks about one positive source of anger, and she says, I recognize one for me, and this doesn't rule out the possibility of other positive sources or aspects of anger. She says self-respect. When slighted or patronized, I flare up in fury and attack right then, right there. I have no guilt about it. But there's a problem with this. It often turns out to have been a misunderstanding. The disrespect was not intended or was mere clumsiness. And even if it was intended, so what? And so she says, all right, I'm going to put that aside. That hasn't really been that profitable to explore. Where is my anger coming from? And by extension, where is the anger of other people typically coming from? And she says, it's probably coming more from what she calls negatives, jealousy, which she also connects to envy, hatred, and fear. And so she says, fear is a common thing that comes up. If I'm in an angry mood, I can ask myself, what are you afraid of? Sometimes anger is provoked because we're feeling out of control. We're feeling afraid about things. We're going to come back to that in a moment. What about jealousy or envy? The two very closely related emotions. And for anybody who's confused about those, typically when we're saying jealousy, we mean that we're talking about sort of a contested good that we have some access to and we feel is our own, but others are threatening it. They could take it away. So I'm jealous of somebody else looking at my spouse and flirting with them, right? Whereas envy is a desire to have what another has and feeling a kind of pain that they have it and you don't have it. So if I want the candy bar that somebody else got in their Halloween candy, even though I didn't go trick-or-treating, that's envy, right? That's not jealousy. If I want to keep you from eating my candy bar, hands off, that's jealousy. So she says, jealousy sticks its nasty yellow-green snout mostly into my life as a writer. And she gives some examples. I'm jealous of other writers who soar to success on wings of praise. I'm contemptuously angry at them and at the people who praise them if I don't like their writing. And then she goes on and she says, all this jealous anger happens only if I don't like what they write. If I like a writer's writing, praise of that writer makes me happy. And you can read which authors she's actually talking about there. And then she says, okay, where is this coming from? Jealousy of this sort is actually not coming from itself, but from fear. The fear that if these other writers are really the greatest, there's no way I can ever be very good or very highly considered as a writer because there's no way I'm going to write anything like what they write or please the readers and critics that they please. And she says, well, this comes from a kind of insecurity, right? So a lot of times we fear when we're envious, I'm not going to get what somebody else has. Or when we're jealous, I'm not going to get the share of the good that I actually deserve, in relation to, they're going to take too much of it. We're afraid, and then we get angry as a result. What about hatred? So hatred and anger, the connection between them, way, way back, Aristotle actually provides an analysis of the difference between the two in the Rhetoric, but he also notes that hatred can result from anger, and both of them together can lead to social breakdown. She says, anger's connection with hatred is surely very complicated, and I don't understand it all, but again, fear seems to be involved. If you aren't afraid of someone or something threatening or unpleasant, you can, as a rule, despise it, ignore it, or even forget it. If you fear it, you have to hate it. And she says, I guess hatred uses anger as fuel. I don't really know, but there is this connection between hatred and fear and anger. And she says, what I'm coming away from it, though, seems to be a persuasive idea that anger is connected with fear. What is it then that I actually fear? And again, she's not giving you sort of a comprehensive list. This is just an essay. But the two things she does identify, I think many of us can relate to them. Fear of being unsafe, of somebody else putting you in situations that could lead to bodily harm or financial damage or your reputation or take away opportunities from you or damage relationships, right? And fear of not being in control, of having somebody else dominate, exploit, abuse you, right? She talks here about anger perhaps being a denial of the fear, and the connection between anger, fear, and depression as well. She also tells us that suppressed anger itself comes from pain. You suppress your anger. Why? Because if you don't, other people are going to hurt you. And they already have hurt you for showing anger. And then it leads to pain because it is going to come out in other ways. Maybe in a huge outburst, maybe in passive aggressivity. So pain is another one of those things. So we have quite a few negative emotions, all of which wind up being connected with fear and pain and anger itself. And I want to close this on two, let's call them enigmas rather than questions. Riddles, things that are not completely resolved in this. One of them involves a narrative, a story that she's going to tell. And she says that if there is a moral to this tale, I don't know what it is. And what is the story? Well, her mother tells her about a psychiatrist who, when Ursula K. Leguin and her siblings were young, told her mother, don't punish them, don't hit them when you're angry. And her mother was like, okay, I guess that makes sense. And then afterwards she thought about it. She's like, so wait a second, are you telling me I'm supposed to hit my kids when I'm not angry with them? That seems kind of counterintuitive. And why did she actually bring this up? Because Ursula K. Le Guin's child, 2 years old, came over, looked at her, and then bit her right on the leg while her mother was there. And Ursula K. Le Guin, out of reflex, backhands the child, and the child, gets knocked away. And then there's she says, tears, but no apologies. And everything goes back to being normal. And her mom tells her story, and then also says, by the way, your brother did this when he was 2 years old, and he kept doing it, and then finally one day I smacked him, and he stopped doing it, and, there it is. And, we could say, well, we're sort of like kittens in that respect when we're babies. We do all sorts of destructive things, because we're predator creatures. We're not primarily prey creatures, but even they do goofy things like that. And Ursula K. Le Guin offers us this story for us to think about. She doesn't want us to jump to a conclusion, oh, I know the answer to the story. She wants us to think about it, mull it over, and if there is a moral, figure out what the moral is for ourselves. She also ends on another sort of question, which is, I would say, related to this. And she says, what is the way to use anger to fuel something other than hurt? To direct it away from hatred, vengefulness, self-righteousness, the negative aspects, the ways in which anger becomes unjust and dangerous, and make it serve creation and compassion. Now notice, that is different than saying, when is my anger justified? How can I use anger for justice, for addressing wrongs, for defending rights? How can we go beyond and use it for something more positive, like compassion or genuine creativity? Those are, in this essay, also unresolved questions, and Le Guin is perfectly fine with leaving space for us to consider these a little bit further, going beyond her own essay.